In the heart of an empire built on faith, within halls lit by candlelight and whispered prayer, there lies a fear. It's a fear older than the magnificent dome of St. Peter's, more ancient than the Latin scriptures themselves. Tonight, we uncover a fear the Vatican never truly buried, a fear not of devils or heretics, but of something far, far older. Long before the rise of the Church, the temples of Egypt held a profound secret about the nature of reality. They called it Heka. It wasn't superstition, as later histories would claim. It was a precision science. The understanding that the universe itself was born from divine utterance and that humans, created in that image, could harness the same creative force. They believed that spoken words, when charged with intention and pronounced with precision, could shape the physical world. It was the physics of the soul, and it worked. When Christianity began its inexorable spread, this ancient power didn't simply vanish. It was absorbed, rewritten, silenced, but never completely destroyed. This story is not about fantasy, it is about control. Because the core of Heka presented a terrifying truth. If you can speak to the divine without a priest, you don't need a church. If your own soul holds a spark of creation, you cannot be ruled. And that is what they feared. So, before you continue on with your night, ask yourself, what was so powerful that it had to be erased? And why, after 2 millennia, are they still afraid of us remembering? If you believe some questions are worth asking, join us. We are about to open the book they tried to burn.
Welcome to Secrets of the Ancients, where ancient mysteries awaken.
Our journey into the Vatican's deepest fear doesn't begin in the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, nor in the hallowed marble halls of Rome. It begins in a place far more mundane, yet in its own way just as revealing. Leiden, Holland. The year is 1824. Europe is buzzing, intoxicated with the discoveries pouring out from the ancient world. Napoleon's campaigns, for all their military ambition, had unintentionally kicked open a door to the past that had been sealed for over a millennium. Museums across the continent were filling up with relics, statues, and sarcophagi, the plunder of a fallen civilization. Most of it was catalogued with a kind of detached, academic curiosity. A list of goods from a tomb here, a funerary prayer there. It was history, safely confined behind glass. But every now and then, something slips through the cracks, something that doesn't fit the narrative, something anomalous. In the back rooms of the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities, a young, fiercely intelligent scholar named Jean-Luc Dubois was tasked with the tedious work of sorting through a recently acquired collection. It was the forgotten refuse of the French occupation of Egypt, crates of artifacts deemed not spectacular enough for the Louvre, passed on to a smaller institution. His days were a blur of pottery shards and linen fragments, but one afternoon he pried open a chest that was different. It wasn't ornate. It was a simple, crumbling wooden box mislabeled as Coptic textiles. There was no golden glint, no immediate promise of a spectacular find. But when the lid creaked open, the air in the room changed. There was a faint, dry scent of acacia and something else, something electric. Wrapped in decaying linen was not cloth, but a papyrus. It was remarkably well preserved. As Dubois carefully unrolled the first few inches, he expected the usual fare. A tax record, perhaps a spell to protect a dead man's stomach. His brow furrowed. The script was clear, the ink a deep, resonant black that seemed almost wet, as if it had been applied only a century ago, not 2,000 years. He began to translate, his breath catching in his throat. This was no prayer to a distant god. This was a statement of power. The first line he deciphered read, "The divine does not dwell in the heavens. It is the vibration waiting in the throat of the initiate." Think about that for a second. In an age when the relationship with God was defined by distance, by submission and supplication, here was a text that spoke of divinity as an internal, accessible force. It didn't ask for belief. It offered a method. Dubois worked feverishly for days, forgetting to eat, his world shrinking to the strange, elegant symbols on the page. The papyrus laid out what could only be described as a form of spiritual physics. It spoke of aligning the body with celestial cycles, of using specific vocal tones, not prayers but frequencies, to alter the resonance of both mind and matter. One section detailed a ritual for what it called waking the Ka, the vital spark not in the afterlife but while still living. It described how to build a resonant chamber where a person's voice, amplified and reflected, could induce visions, or what the text called a memory of the first light. It contained passages that would have been shocking to any scholar, but to the religious sensibilities of 19th century Europe, they were nothing short of explosive. "I am not a subject of the gods, I am a participant in their becoming." Another line read, "To speak the true name of a star is to borrow its fire." This wasn't just magic, it was a declaration of spiritual independence. It was a how-to guide for becoming your own messiah. In his academic excitement, Dubois did what any scholar would do. He wrote to his esteemed mentor in Paris, detailing his astonishing find. He described the text's contents, its radical philosophy, its potential to rewrite everything they thought they knew about Egyptian spirituality. He was naive. He saw it as a historical breakthrough. He failed to see it for what it truly was, a threat. His mentor, a man with deep connections to the Catholic intellectual community, read the letter not with excitement, but with a cold, rising dread. We don't know the exact chain of communication because such things are never written down. But we can imagine the whispers, a hushed conversation in a Parisian salon, a coded message sent by courier, a quiet report placed on a very important desk in a very private Vatican office. The reaction in Rome was not a theological debate. It was a silent, swift, and meticulously organized security operation. This wasn't a matter for scholars. It was a matter for the men who handle problems. Within weeks, 2 gentlemen arrived in Leyden. They didn't wear clerical robes. They were dressed in fine, dark suits, speaking fluent Dutch with a faint Italian accent. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men who were used to getting what they wanted. They didn't go to Jean-Luc Dubois. They went directly to the museum's director. We have no official record of that conversation, but we can piece it together from what happened next. A substantial, anonymous donation was made to the museum's endowment fund. The 2 visitors were given a private tour of the archives. The director, a man suddenly faced with a choice between a single, controversial artifact and the financial future of his institution, made the only decision he could. When Dubois returned to the archive the following Monday, eager to continue his translation, he found an empty drawer. He panicked. He demanded answers. The official story was flimsy, rehearsed. The papyrus, he was told, was exceptionally fragile. It had been transferred to a private facility in Rome with superior preservation capabilities. A generous offer from an anonymous benefactor to ensure its survival. It was for the good of history, they said. He was asked to sign a document, a non-disclosure agreement to protect the delicate nature of the transfer. He knew it was a lie. He argued, he protested, but he was a junior academic against a wall of institutional power. His inquiries were met with polite deflections, then with cold silence. His career stalled. He was labeled as difficult, obsessive. The ghost of that missing papyrus would haunt him for the rest of his life. So what happened to the scroll? The so-called Leiden papyrus, as it became known in the hushed circles of rogue Egyptologists, vanished from the public record. It was never displayed. No Vatican-approved scholar ever published a translation. Its catalog number was scrubbed, the entry replaced with a simple, sterile note, item lost or damaged post-acquisition. It ceased to exist. Why such extreme measures? Why mobilize a covert operation to acquire and bury one ancient scroll among thousands? Was it truly so dangerous, or was the idea it contained so powerful? The Church has weathered countless heresies, gospels that told a different story of Christ, philosophical challenges to its doctrine. But this was different. This wasn't philosophy. It was technology, a spiritual technology, a system that promised direct access to power, bypassing the entire institutional framework of priests, sacraments, and salvation through a single savior. It proposed that divinity wasn't a story you were told, but a force you could learn to wield. The Leiden papyrus wasn't just a heretical text. It was a competitor's instruction manual. And in the business of souls, you don't allow the competition to publish their trade secrets. This incident, this ghost in the archives, is our foundational piece of evidence. It reveals a pattern of behavior. It shows us that the Vatican's relationship with ancient knowledge isn't one of preservation, but of curation. And curation, by its very nature, is an act of control. You decide what is seen, what is known, and most importantly, what is buried. The disappearance of the Leiden papyrus wasn't an act of protecting faith. It was an act of protecting a monopoly, and it begs the question that will drive our entire investigation. What else have they found? What other keys to our own power are locked away in their vaults, waiting in silence? The story of the Leiden papyrus proves that the silence is intentional, and our task now is to begin breaking it. If our first clue in this investigation was an act of concealment, the burying of a dangerous text, then our second is an act of open, psychological warfare. It's a strategy as old as empire itself. If you cannot erase a people's gods, you must turn them into devils. You don't just defeat them, you vilify them. You transform their objects of reverence into figures of terror. This wasn't a simple theological disagreement. It was a calculated, multi-generational marketing campaign designed to achieve a hostile takeover of the human soul. To understand how it worked, we need to look at the victims of this character assassination and see what they were before they were twisted into monsters. Let's start with one of the most recognizable figures of the Egyptian pantheon, Anubis. Today, if you see that elegant black jackal head, your mind probably jumps to a very specific set of ideas: darkness, death, the underworld. He's become a stock character for a spooky, funereal god, but this is a pale, distorted shadow of his true role. In the Egyptian mind, Anubis wasn't the god of death. That's a profound misunderstanding. He was the gentle, solemn guide through death. He was a protector, a psychopomp, a Greek term meaning a guide of souls. When a soul left the body, it was confused, disoriented. Anubis was the steady hand in the darkness, the one who would lead you to the hall of judgment. His most famous role was in the weighing of the heart ceremony, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth. In this crucial moment, Anubis wasn't a menacing figure. He was the master of ceremonies, the one who ensured the scales were true. He was an arbiter of justice, a figure of comfort and integrity. He was the one who would announce if a soul was worthy of entering the eternal paradise of the field of reeds. He was more like a compassionate spiritual attorney than a grim reaper. So, how do you turn a figure of comfort into a symbol of dread? You focus on his image and strip it of all its original context. Why a jackal? Because jackals were often seen patrolling the edges of the desert cemeteries at dusk. To the Egyptians, this wasn't sinister. They saw these animals as the natural guardians of the necropolis, protecting the sacred burial grounds from intruders. They were watchers in the twilight, keepers of the boundary between the living and the dead. But to an outsider, to an early Christian propagandist looking for a foothold, that image was a gift. A canine creature prowling among the tombs at night. It was perfect. They didn't need to invent a demon, they just had to rebrand an existing god. Anubis the guardian became Anubis the graver-robber. Anubis the guide became Anubis the soul snatcher. His serene, black form, which for the Egyptians represented the fertile soil of the Nile and the mystery of regeneration, was recast as the color of pure, empty blackness, the void. He was no longer a guide waiting to lead you to the light. He was a monster waiting to drag you down into it. This wasn't an accident, it was a strategy, and Anubis was just the beginning. What about knowledge? What about wisdom itself? In Egypt, that domain belonged to Thoth. Depicted with the head of the sacred ibis, Thoth was the architect of reality. He was the divine scribe, the inventor of writing, mathematics, and astronomy. He was the keeper of the Akashic records, if you will, the one who recorded all that has ever happened. He was the voice of reason, the master of the divine word. In a world built on Heka, the magic of creation through speech, Thoth was the one who wrote the dictionary. Now ask yourself, what is more dangerous to an institution that demands faith above all else? A God who offers knowledge. A God who encourages you to learn, to measure, to record, to understand the mechanics of the universe for yourself. Thoth represented a path to the divine through the intellect, through direct personal discovery. This made him a direct competitor to a faith system that was beginning to insist that the only path was through belief in a single book and a single hierarchy of priests. So how did they deal with Thoth? They couldn't call him evil. How do you call wisdom evil? Instead, they made him dangerous. They made him a trickster. They took his mastery of magic, which, remember, was seen as a divine science, and reframed it as sorcery, a dark, forbidden art. The god of knowledge became the keeper of secrets too dangerous for man to know. His wisdom was no longer a path to enlightenment. It was a temptation, a trick to lead you away from the simple, pure faith offered by the church. His sacred ibis head, a symbol of wisdom and precision, was made to look alien, untrustworthy. In some later Christian-influenced texts, he's demoted from a god to a mere demonic scribe, dutifully recording the names of the damned in the ledgers of hell. They took the librarian of the cosmos and turned him into hell's accountant. But the campaign of demonization didn't stop with the benevolent. It also had to neutralize the complex, the ambiguous, the gods who represented the untamable forces of nature. And none were more formidable than the goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, the Eye of Ra. Her power was absolute and terrifying. She was the bringer of plagues, the goddess of war, her breath the hot desert wind. But here's the part they chose to erase. She was also the patroness of doctors and healers. Priests of Sekhmet were some of the most skilled physicians in the ancient world. She was the one you prayed to in order to avert the very plagues she was said to command. She held destruction and healing in the same hand. This duality is sophisticated. It reflects a deep understanding of the world. The same fire that burns a village can also forge a tool. The same storm that floods a field also brings the water needed for life. Sekhmet represented power in its purest, most neutral form, a force that was dangerous, yes, but also essential. The burgeoning Christian theology could not tolerate such nuance. Its entire model was built on a stark, simple binary, good versus evil, God versus Satan, light versus dark. A goddess who was both a destroyer and a healer didn't fit into their neat little boxes. She blurred the lines, so they performed a surgical edit. They kept her fury, her lion-headed wrath, her association with pestilence and death. All of that was amplified. She became a perfect stand-in for divine, Old Testament-style vengeance. But her other half, her role as a mighty healer, the Lady of Life, was quietly cut away. It was forgotten. They broke the goddess in two and threw away the inconvenient half. What was left was a monster, a pure symbol of destruction, a forerunner to the snarling, beast-like demons that would populate the nightmares of medieval Europe. Anubis, Thoth, Sekhmet. One by one, the pillars of the Egyptian pantheon were either torn down or twisted into grotesque caricatures of their former selves. But the master stroke of this entire campaign was not just the demonization of individual gods. It was the creation of a single, unifying figurehead for all that was other, all that was pagan. It was the invention of the devil as we know him. Consider the Egyptian god Set. He is often called the god of evil, but this is, again, a gross oversimplification. Set was the god of the desert, of storms, of chaos, of foreigners. He was the adversary to Horus, the god of divine order and kingship. But their struggle was not good versus evil. It was the necessary cosmic tension between order and chaos, civilization and the untamed wilderness, the known and the unknown. In the Egyptian worldview, you could not have one without the other. Chaos was a necessary force to break down old structures and allow for new creation. Set was vital to the cosmic balance. The early church, however, saw the story of an adversary and recognized its potential. They took Set's role, stripped it of all its philosophical nuance, and forged it into the concept of a singular, absolute enemy, Satan, whose very name means the adversary. They took Set's association with the harsh, red desert and turned it into the fires of hell. They took his strange, composite animal head and used it as a blueprint for the beastly, horned appearance of the devil. They created a villain, a single, terrifying entity onto which all the fears of the old world could be projected. And into the DNA of this new supervillain, they wove the threads of all the other gods they had slandered. The darkness of Anubis, the forbidden knowledge of Thoth, the destructive fury of Sekhmet. The devil wasn't a fallen angel from their own mythology. He was a Frankenstein's monster, stitched together from the dismembered corpses of the Egyptian gods. So why? Why go to all this trouble? Because it was the most effective way to conquer a spiritual landscape. You give the people a new set of stories, a new hero, and most importantly, a new, much scarier villain. You tell them their old protectors are now the things they need protection from. You create a spiritual vacuum, and then you position your own institution as the only thing that can fill it. It was, without a doubt, the most successful propaganda campaign in human history. And its success is measured by the fact that even today, these ancient, profound deities are mostly known to us through the lens of the demonic masks they were forced to wear. The question is, if they lied about the gods, what else did they lie about? We've seen how the church dealt with inconvenient ideas by burying them, and how they dealt with inconvenient gods by turning them into monsters. But what do you do when an entire civilization's memory is not written in flammable papyrus, but carved into thousands of tons of stone? What do you do when a library is so vast it spans an entire country? You can't burn it. You can't hide it. So you do the next best thing. You make it unreadable. You turn a language into a mystery. You convince the world that the key has been lost forever and that it's better that way. This was the next phase of the campaign, the war on words, the strategic silencing of the hieroglyphs. For nearly 500 years, the temples and tombs of Egypt were a landscape of beautiful, impenetrable symbols. To the Romans, the Arabs, and the medieval Europeans who saw them, they were little more than exotic decorations, quaint pictures of birds, snakes, and curious human figures. They were seen as a primitive form of writing if they were considered writing at all. The prevailing wisdom, heavily influenced and promoted by the Church, was that these were not letters but mystical symbols, each one containing a complex, secret philosophical idea, impossible for the uninitiated to grasp. Or worse, they were the literal script of sorcerers, spells frozen in stone that could unleash dark forces if spoken aloud. Think about how brilliant that is. You take a sophisticated phonetic language, a tool for recording everything from grain harvests to the movement of stars, and you rebrand it as dangerous, demonic gibberish. You create an aura of fear around the very act of trying to understand it. To study the hieroglyphs was to flirt with heresy, to invite madness, to traffic with the pagan darkness the Church had worked so hard to defeat. But was that the real reason for the quarantine? Was the Vatican truly afraid that a scholar might accidentally summon a demon by reading an inscription off a temple wall? Or was that just a convenient, spooky cover story for a much deeper, more pragmatic fear? A fear not of what the glyphs could do, but of what they could say. Let's be clear. The hieroglyphs were a threat not because they were magical, but because they were a library. A library that held a version of history that was deeply, fundamentally incompatible with the one upon which the Church was building its entire authority. It was a direct challenge to their timeline, their stories, and their claim as the sole proprietors of truth. First, and most critically, there was the threat to the timeline of creation itself. By the Renaissance and into the modern era, Christian theologians, most famously Archbishop Ussher, had meticulously calculated the age of the earth based on the genealogies in the Bible. They had arrived at a very specific date for creation. The evening of October 22nd, 4004 BC. The entire history of humanity, from Adam and Eve to the present day, had to fit within that tight 6000-year window. This was not just a theory, it was dogma. The hieroglyphs laughed at this timeline. Once deciphered, ancient Egyptian records like the Turin King List and the Palermo Stone revealed dynasties of pharaohs stretching back thousands of years before 4004 BC. They even spoke of a mythical period before the first pharaohs, a golden age ruled by the gods themselves that lasted for tens of thousands of years. If the Egyptian civilization was already ancient when the Bible's world was supposed to have begun, then the entire book of Genesis was no longer the literal history of the world. It was simply the tribal history of a people. It demoted the Bible from a universal truth to a local one. This was an existential threat. Second, there was the threat of silence. The story of the Exodus is a cornerstone of the Abrahamic faiths. The enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Hebrews for centuries, their miraculous escape led by Moses, the 10 plagues that devastated Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea. It's an epic, nation-defining event. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They carved everything into stone: triumphant battles, trade agreements, the daily rations for tomb builders, even graffiti left by workers. And yet, in all the thousands upon thousands of hieroglyphic inscriptions ever discovered, there is a deafening silence. There is not one single mention of a massive Hebrew slave population. No record of any of the plagues as described in the Bible. No inscription about the catastrophic loss of an entire army in the Red Sea. For a civilization that documented everything, this lack of corroborating evidence is not just a curiosity. It's a problem, a big one. The silence of the stones was an inconvenient truth that the Church preferred not to address. As long as no one could read them, no one could ask the awkward question: if this monumental event happened, why did the Egyptians of all people forget to write it down? Finally, the glyphs posed a threat to the narrative of intellectual succession. The church-approved version of history held that high civilization flowed from Greece, was perfected by Rome, and then inherited by Christian Europe. The Egyptians were seen as impressive builders, but their science and philosophy were considered primitive. But the hieroglyphs, once read, told a different story. Texts like the Edwin Smith papyrus revealed a knowledge of surgery and anatomy so advanced it wouldn't be seen again for over 2,000 years. Astronomical texts showed a precise understanding of the solar year and the 26,000-year cycle of precession. This knowledge didn't fit. It suggested that the Greeks, far from inventing philosophy and science, may have been students themselves, learning at the feet of a much older, wiser civilization. Faced with these threats, the only viable strategy was to ensure the language remained dead. This was achieved through a combination of active destruction and passive neglect. The burning of the Library of Alexandria wasn't a single event, but a slow-motion catastrophe over centuries, with Christian mobs in the 4th and 5th centuries delivering some of the final, fatal blows. They weren't just burning books, they were burning a rival center of gravity for human knowledge. In the centuries that followed, any scholar who got too close to the Egyptian mysteries was treated with suspicion. The subject became academically toxic. For 14 centuries, the silence held. The walls stood mute, their secrets locked away. And then came one man who refused to accept the official story: Jean-Francois Champollion. He was a linguistic prodigy, obsessed from childhood with the mystery of Egypt. He didn't believe the glyphs were just mystical pictures. He felt with an unshakable intuition that they were a true language, and he dedicated his life to proving it. His key, of course, was the Rosetta Stone, that famous slab of granite with the same decree written in 3 scripts: formal hieroglyphs, everyday demotic script, and Greek. Others had tried and failed, convinced that the glyphs were purely symbolic. Champollion's genius was in realizing they were a hybrid system, a complex and beautiful fusion of symbols that stood for ideas, and symbols that stood for sounds, just like our alphabet. In 1822, after years of painstaking work, he finally cracked the code. The legend says he ran from his office to his brothers, shouted, "G Tynes mon affair, I've got it," and promptly collapsed, remaining unconscious for 5 days. It was as if he had absorbed the shock of 400 years of silence being broken all at once. Because with his discovery, the stones of Egypt began to speak again, and they spoke of a history deeper, a science more advanced, and a spirituality more complex than the official narrative had ever allowed. The church could no longer enforce the silence. The code was out. But control can be subtle. Even after the translations began pouring out, there's the lingering question of access. Which tombs remain sealed without explanation? Which texts, stored in museum basements or private collections, have yet to be fully translated and published? Is the curation of knowledge still happening, just in a quieter, more bureaucratic way? The war on the hieroglyphs wasn't just a medieval prejudice against a pagan culture. It was a calculated, long-term strategy to control history itself. By rendering a people's language incomprehensible, you render their memory powerless. Champollion didn't just give us a dictionary. He gave a civilization its voice back. And that voice is still telling a story that some of the most powerful institutions in the world would rather we didn't hear. If you can successfully rebrand a civilization's gods into your own devils and lock away their history behind a wall of silence, you've won a major battle in the war for control. But you still have a problem. What do you do with their practices? What do you do with their rituals, their spiritual sciences, their core beliefs about life, death, and the nature of the soul itself? You can't just ignore them. They are too powerful, too deeply woven into the human psyche. So you enact a new 3-pronged strategy. First, you ridicule what you cannot understand. Second, you demonize what you cannot control. And third, and this is the most insidious tactic of all, you steal what you find useful and you claim you invented it. This chapter of our investigation is about that process. The calculated misrepresentation, demonization, and ultimate appropriation of Egypt's most sacred spiritual technologies. Let's begin with a practice that has been shrouded in more mystery and deliberate misinformation than perhaps any other: alchemy. When I say the word alchemist, what image comes to mind? For most of us, it's a caricature, a figure straight out of a fantasy novel. An old, bearded man hunched over bubbling beakers in a dusty, torch-lit laboratory, obsessively trying to turn base metals like lead into pure gold. It's a story of greed, of a fool's errand, a failed pseudoscience. This image is not an accident. It is, I would argue, the result of a centuries-long public relations campaign designed to obscure the true purpose of the great work. To find the truth, we have to follow the word itself. Alchemy comes to us through Arabic alchemia, but the Arabs got it from the Greeks, who were referring to the land of Egypt. The root word is chem or kemet, the Egyptians' own name for their nation. It meant the Black Land, referring to the rich, dark, fertile soil deposited by the Nile's annual flood. Think about that. The art of alchemy is literally the art of the Black Land. It wasn't born in medieval Europe. Its soul belongs to the Nile Valley. And that fertile black soil was the most powerful symbol the Egyptians had. Out of this dark mud, all life emerged, season after season. It was the symbol of transformation, of regeneration, of life emerging from what looks like inert death. This is the key. Egyptian alchemy was never about metallurgy. It was about metaphysics. It was a deeply spiritual, psychological science that used the language of metals as a metaphor for the transformation of the human soul. In the alchemical worldview, lead was not the physical metal. It was the prima materia, the primal matter. It symbolized the ordinary human state, heavy, dull, ignorant, weighed down by fear and base desires. It was the soul in its unawakened, unconscious state. And gold? Gold was not about getting rich. Gold was the symbol of enlightenment. It is incorruptible. It doesn't tarnish or decay. It shines with its own light like the sun. It represented the perfected soul, awakened, purified, conscious, and eternal. The entire great work, with all its complex stages, the nigredo, a blackening, a descent into one's own shadow, the albedo, a whitening, a purification, and the rubedo, a reddening, the final attainment of the divine state, was a roadmap for inner transformation. It was a disciplined process for burning away the lead of the ego to reveal the eternal gold of the true self. Now, consider the implications of that. If the highest spiritual attainment, the unification with the divine, is an internal process, a science of the soul that one can undertake through personal effort, discipline, and knowledge, then where does that leave the church? It leaves it on the outside, looking in. The entire institutional framework of salvation, a system requiring priests as intermediaries, confession for absolution, baptism for entry, and a belief in a single Savior, becomes unnecessary. Alchemy offered a path to God that was personal, direct, and self-empowering. It was a DIY guide to divinity. And for an institution built on being the sole gatekeeper, that was the most dangerous idea in the world. So, how do you fight an idea like that? You can't just burn all the books. The idea is too seductive. Instead, you ridicule it. You strip away the profound metaphor and present only the literal, foolish-sounding surface. You encourage the world to laugh at the old man trying to make gold in his basement. You rebrand the alchemist from a spiritual seeker into a greedy charlatan. It was a far more effective tool of suppression than the Inquisitors' pyre. They didn't just kill the alchemists, they killed the dignity of their art. While alchemy was a process for the living, the Church's campaign extended even more aggressively to the rituals for the dead. And here, ridicule wasn't enough. The subject was too sacred, too potent. Here they had to resort to demonization. Let's look at one of the most sacred rites in all of Egyptian civilization, the opening of the mouth ceremony. When early Christian scholars first learned of this ritual, they reacted with horror. They branded it as necromancy, as a satanic abomination, as proof of Egypt's trafficking with demons. But what was it, really? To the Egyptians, death was not an end point. It was a transition into another state of being. But for the soul to survive this journey, it needed its senses. It needed to be able to see the path, hear the divine words, speak its own name to prove its identity, and eat the spiritual food offered to it. The opening of the mouth was the sacred ritual that symbolically reactivated these senses for the deceased's spiritual body, the ka. Using special instruments like an adze shaped like a star, priests would gently touch the mouth, eyes, nose, and ears of the mummy or a statue representing the deceased. It was an act of profound love, a final gift from the living to the dead to ensure they had the tools they needed to navigate eternity. But in the eyes of the Church, this was a terrifying transgression. Humans were performing a rite that seemed to give life back to the dead. It suggested that mortals had a measure of power over the soul's journey, a power the Church insisted belonged to God alone. It demonstrated a spiritual science so sophisticated it was indistinguishable from magic. So they labeled it devil worship. They used it as a prime example of pagan darkness, a horrifying ritual to scare converts into the arms of the one true faith. They took an act of compassion and twisted it into a portrait of pure evil. This twisting of ritual, however, pales in comparison to their treatment of Egypt's ultimate spiritual concept, resurrection. This is where the story moves beyond mere suppression and into territory that shakes the very foundations of Western religion. The absolute, unshakable cornerstone of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is presented as a singular, world-altering event, a unique miracle that proves his divinity and offers the promise of eternal life to all who believe. But what if it wasn't unique? What if the blueprint for that story had already been written, not in Aramaic or Greek, but in Egyptian hieroglyphs, more than 1,000 years before Christ was born? The text we call the Book of the Dead is more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was a collection of spells and instructions, a guide for the soul's journey. Let's look at what it describes. The soul of the deceased enters the underworld and is brought to the Hall of Two Truths. There they stand before a panel of 42 divine judges and must declare their innocence. The negative confession. Then comes the main event, the weighing of the heart against the feather of truth before the great god Osiris. Osiris, a god who himself was murdered, dismembered, and then resurrected by the love of his wife Isis. Sound familiar? If the heart is lighter than the feather, the soul is declared true of voice and is granted eternal life. It is born again into the paradise of the field of reeds. The texts are explicit. I shall not perish, I shall not be destroyed. My flesh shall not decay. I shall live, I shall live. Let's put the pieces on the table. A divine figure who dies and is resurrected. A final judgment before God. A weighing of one's life's deeds against a standard of truth. The promise of being born again into a sinless, eternal paradise. The parallels to the Christian narrative of judgment, salvation, and resurrection are not just vague or coincidental. They are structural. They are profound. They are, to be blunt, far too close for comfort. When scholars first began to translate these texts in the 19th century, it must have sent a quiet panic through the halls of the Vatican. This discovery suggested that the most sacred story in Christianity wasn't a historical anomaly. It was, perhaps, the ultimate and most powerful expression of a spiritual archetype that had been rehearsed and refined in the temples of the Nile for millennia. The Church's response. It did what it always does with inconvenient evidence. It couldn't destroy the Book of the Dead, so it downplayed it. It was relegated to the realm of mythology, of primitive pagan fantasy, while the Gospels were held up as divine, historical fact. They effectively drew a curtain around the source code. But the strategy wasn't just to ridicule and demonize. The final and perhaps most audacious tactic was to appropriate. The Church, while publicly condemning Egyptian magic, seemed to recognize its power behind closed doors. It acted like a conquering army that, after tearing down the enemy's temples, quietly takes the most powerful stones from the ruins to build its own fortress. Think of the Catholic Mass. For centuries, it was conducted exclusively in Latin, a dead language understood only by the clergy. This created an atmosphere of mystery and power, where the words themselves, spoken correctly by an initiated priest, were seen to have transformative power, the transubstantiation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Is this not a perfect echo of the Egyptian belief in Heka, where the correctly spoken ritual words could alter reality itself? Is the famous opening of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A new revelation, or a beautifully rephrased articulation of an ancient Egyptian magical principle. Consider the rituals themselves. The use of holy water for purification mirrors the sacred Nile water used in temple cleansing rites. The extensive use of incense to create a sacred, divine atmosphere is a direct inheritance from Egyptian temple practice. The act of anointing with consecrated oil, a key part of both royal and priestly consecration in Egypt, survives in Christian sacraments from baptism to last rites. These aren't just coincidences, they are fingerprints. It seems the Church didn't just vanquish its predecessor, it absorbed it. It took the powerful, psychologically resonant rituals of an ancient faith, stripped them of their original context and meaning, and repurposed them under a new brand. It was the ultimate victory, not just defeating your rival, but stealing their weapons, melting them down, and forging them into your own crown. And in doing so, they ensured that for 2,000 years, the world would admire the fortress, without ever knowing the origin of the powerful stones from which it was built. In our journey through the hidden corridors of history, we've seen how empires rise and fall, how ideas are born and how they are buried. Now we must turn our attention to an organization that has mastered the art of survival and influence unlike any other. An organization born in a time of crisis, forged in the fires of absolute devotion, and accused for centuries of being the shadowy hand guiding the course of world events. We must speak of the Society of Jesus, known to the world as the Jesuits, and we must examine the silent, pagan monolith that stands at the very heart of their power, the Vatican's obelisk. To understand the Jesuits, we must first understand the world that created them. Imagine Europe in the early 16th century. The Catholic Church, for 1,000 years the undisputed spiritual authority of the West, is in a state of crisis. Martin Luther has nailed his theses to the church door, and the Protestant Reformation is tearing Christendom apart. Kingdoms are breaking away, the faithful are in doubt, and the very foundations of the Vatican are shaking. The church is under siege, and it needs a new kind of army. That army would be founded not by a priest or a scholar, but by a soldier. His name was Inigo or Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish nobleman and a man of war. In 1521, during the Battle of Pamplona, his leg was shattered by a cannonball, ending his military career. During his long and agonizing recovery, with nothing to read but religious texts, he underwent a profound spiritual transformation. The soldier of the Spanish king decided to become a soldier for Christ, but he never truly left the battlefield behind. He simply changed its location from the physical world to the spiritual and intellectual one. Ignatius conceived of his new order, the Society of Jesus, using a military model. It was to be a highly disciplined, mobile, and elite force of spiritual soldiers, able to go anywhere in the world and do anything necessary to defend and advance the interests of the Catholic Church. At the core of his training was a month-long silent retreat known as the spiritual exercises, an intense system of meditation and psychological conditioning designed to break down the individual ego and rebuild it in absolute devotion to the cause. The official mission of the Jesuits was threefold: to establish schools and become the world's greatest educators, to spread the Catholic faith through global missionary work, and to maintain absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the Pope. And on the surface, their success was staggering. They quickly became the most respected educators in Europe, the confessors to kings and emperors, brilliant scientists, and intrepid explorers who mapped vast regions of the world. This is the mainstream story, the story of the intellectual arm of the Counter-Reformation. But there has always been a shadow story, a narrative whispered in the courts of Europe and in the halls of their rivals. It's a story of an organization that operated on the principle of the ends justify the means. A story of a global intelligence network that rivaled any governments. A story of a secretive, powerful fraternity whose leader, the superior general, was known as the Black Pope for the simple black cassock he wore and the immense, unseen power he wielded. Their critics saw them not as missionaries, but as master manipulators, political assassins, and the secret police of the papacy. This reputation for shadowy power and unwavering obedience makes them a central force in the story of what happened next. Now, let us leave the story of the Jesuits for a moment and travel to the heart of their empire, Rome. Specifically, St. Peter's Square. Stand in the center of Bernini's magnificent colonnade, those sweeping arms of the Mother Church reaching out to embrace the world. Before you is the grand Basilica of St. Peter, the largest church in Christendom. And there, in the very center of the square, perfectly aligned with the center of the Basilica's great dome, is something that, when you truly stop to think about it, makes absolutely no sense. It is an obelisk, a single, seamless spear of red granite, weighing over 350 tons and standing nearly 100 feet tall. It is not Roman, and it is certainly not Christian. It is Egyptian. It was carved in Heliopolis, the city of the sun, nearly 4,000 years ago during the reign of the pharaohs. It has no Christian carvings, no biblical inscriptions. It is a purely pagan monument, a colossal phallic symbol dedicated to the Egyptian sun god, Ra. So the question is, why? Why is one of the most sacred and potent symbols of an ancient pagan religion standing at the absolute epicenter of the Catholic world? It is the ultimate architectural and theological contradiction. The official story is one of triumph. The obelisk was brought from Egypt to Rome in the year 37 AD by the Emperor Caligula as a trophy of conquest. He erected it in the center of his private circus, a stadium for chariot races. According to tradition, it was in this very circus that St. Peter, the first pope, was crucified upside down. For 1,500 years, the obelisk stood there, a silent witness to centuries of Roman history. Then, in 1586, Pope Sixtus V a powerful and ambitious pontiff determined to rebuild Rome into a magnificent Christian capital, decided to move it. It was an engineering challenge of epic proportions. The man who masterminded the move, Domenico Fontana, used hundreds of horses, thousands of men, and a complex system of ropes and towers to lower, transport, and re-erect the massive stone. It was a triumph of Renaissance engineering, and the official story is that the Pope placed it in front of the basilica as a symbol of the Church's ultimate victory over the paganism it had supplanted. He even performed an exorcism on the obelisk and topped it with a cross containing a supposed fragment of the true cross. It was, in this telling, a way of domesticating the pagan monster, of forcing it into the service of Christ. It's a good story. It's a clean story. But it may also be a cover story, because when you look deeper, the official narrative begins to unravel. If the goal was simply to show triumph over paganism, why not destroy it? The Church had a long history of smashing pagan idols. Or if they were to keep it, why not cover it in Christian inscriptions, completely rewriting its identity? The small cross on top seems like a token gesture, leaving the massive pagan shaft almost entirely untouched. And most importantly, why place it in the most sacred and geometrically significant spot imaginable? This is where the two stories, that of the Jesuits and that of the obelisk, begin to merge. Pope Sixtus V was a key figure in the Counter-Reformation, the very movement that the Jesuits were created to lead. The intellectual and engineering climate of his court was heavily dominated by the brilliance and ingenuity of the Jesuit order. They were the thinkers, the scientists, the strategists of the age. And it is here that a more profound and unsettling theory emerges. The theory is this: the placement of the obelisk was not an act of triumph over paganism, but a sophisticated act of absorbing its power. The Jesuit elite were not ignorant men. As the foremost scholars of their time, they had access to the secret archives of the Vatican and were deeply familiar with the rediscovered texts of the ancient world, including the Hermetic and Neoplatonic philosophies that revered ancient Egyptian wisdom. They would have understood that, for the Egyptians, an obelisk was not just a decorative stone. It was a piece of spiritual technology. It was a sacred antenna designed to draw down the power of the sun, the power of the cosmos, and ground it into the earth. It was a point of connection between the above and the below. From this perspective, the Jesuits and Pope Sixtus V were not just redecorating a piazza. They were engaging in a massive ritual of sacred architecture. Their mission was the absolute and total victory of the Church. They knew they couldn't simply destroy the old powers. The most effective strategy was to harness them. Moving the obelisk from the blood-soaked ground of the circus to the sacred heart of the Church was a grand alchemical act. It was a ritual designed to take the ancient, potent, solar power of the Egyptian religion and the imperial power of Rome, and place it directly in the service of the papacy. The story of triumph was the perfect exoteric explanation, the story for the public and the uninitiated. But the esoteric truth, known only to the inner circle, was that they were building a massive spiritual engine. The obelisk became the gnomon of a giant sundial, with the square itself as the face. It became the focal point of an immense concentration of energy, a needle grounding the power of an ancient sun god in service to their new son of God. The Jesuits were not just soldiers and scholars. They were acting as high priests of a new syncretic religion, one that understood how to co-opt the magic of its predecessors. Look at the pattern that follows. Obelisks taken from Egypt now stand in the other major power centers of the Western world. There is one in London, one in Paris, one in New York City, all cities that are hubs of finance and power, and all cities with a deep history of Masonic and other secret society influence. Is it just a coincidence? Or is it the signature of a hidden tradition, a tradition that understands the symbolic and energetic power of these ancient monuments? The Vatican obelisk is not a trophy of a battle won. It is a weapon that was captured and then turned upon its former masters. The cover-up in this story is not a missing document, but a misdirection of meaning. It's a secret hidden in plain sight, a truth that we see every time we look at a picture of Rome, but have been taught not to understand. It is a silent testament to a war of ideas where the ultimate victory lies not in destroying your enemy, but in absorbing their soul and stealing their magic. For centuries, this knowledge remained buried, but history, like energy, is never truly lost. In our digital age, something unexpected is happening. A generation is rediscovering what was erased. They call it chemeticism, hermeticism. They are reading the pyramid texts on their phones, debating the emerald tablet in chat rooms. It's an intellectual and spiritual revival happening beneath the notice of the mainstream. The Vatican has flagged this trend as theological destabilization. But perhaps it isn't destabilization. Perhaps it is a rebalancing, a collective memory stirring from a long slumber. The Church's fear of Egypt was never about curses or dark gods. It was about clarity. The terrifyingly simple idea that humanity did not need a mediator to touch the divine. That the kingdom of heaven is not a destination to be earned through obedience, but a state of consciousness to be unlocked from within. They buried the scrolls, they burned the names, they rewrote the past. They did all this to make us forget one fundamental truth, that real power is not granted from above. It is remembered from within. So we are left with the most profound question of all, the question that has haunted the powerful for millennia and empowered the seeker for just as long. What if the divine is not something you pray to, but something you awaken as? Memory has a way of returning, and when it does, even the darkest vault cannot hold its light.